The summer of 1883 came to the Wyoming Territory like a slow-burning promise. All golden grass and wide sky, the kind of beauty that made a man forget how thin his pockets had grown. The couple had worked their claim outside the small settlement of Cartwell's Crossing for going on 3 years now, scratching a modest homestead from a rocky hillside that the land office man had described, with considerable generosity, as promising. They had built a cabin with their own hands, chinked the gaps with mud and river clay, coaxed a vegetable garden from the reluctant soil, and dug a well that finally hit good water on the 42nd day of trying. They had done everything right. And still, by midsummer, their savings had dwindled to $4.30. He was 31, lean and weathered in the way of men who work outdoors from first light to last, with hands that knew how to mend a fence post and set a crooked wheel. She was 28, quick-minded and steady, the kind of woman who could read a weather sky in the morning and have supper figured out before noon. Together they had survived a brutal winter, a summer drought, and a spring flood that took their potato crop entirely. They were not people who quit easily, but $4.30 was a fact that could not be argued with, and the coming season offered no obvious rescue. It was on a Tuesday morning that he came home from a neighbor's farm with news that most would have dismissed without a second thought. Old Dunnigan, who kept the largest poultry operation in the county, was clearing out his older stock. Hens past their best laying years, roosters grown heavy and slow, birds that had served their purpose and were, by common agreement, destined for nothing more glorious than the stew pot. Dunnigan was practically giving them away. $4 would buy the lot. She stood in the doorway of the cabin and listened as he explained it, her arms folded, her expression careful. Around them, the summer wind moved through the tall grass and the single cottonwood that shaded the south side of their claim. 43 birds, he said. Old ones, sure, but fat enough. He's been feeding them through spring. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked out past the garden, past the small pole barn they had built the previous autumn, toward the rutted track that passed their property and connected Cartwell's Crossing to the main freight road some 8 miles east. Wagons used that road every week. Travelers, freighters, cowboys moving cattle north. We'd have nothing left, she said. We'd have 43 birds, he answered. Another silence settled between them, the kind that carried the full weight of what $4 meant. What it meant to spend the last of it on something every sensible person in the territory would call foolishness. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the patient, unguarded expression of a man who had learned to trust her judgment more than his own. She unfolded her arms. She stepped down from the doorway. Then we'd better go get them, she said. They borrowed a neighbor's wagon for the afternoon, a creaking flatbed with a loose rear axle that complained on every rut, and drove the 8 miles to Emmett Gallagher's farm near the edge of the creek bottom. Gallagher was a wide man with a gray beard and the permanent squint of someone who had spent 30 years reading weather off a horizon. He met them at the gate without ceremony, took the $4, and counted it twice. The chickens were something to see, not in a flattering way. They moved slowly through the dusty yard like old men crossing a church floor, their feathers dull, their combs faded to the color of dried clay. A few roosters stood apart from the hens with the quiet dignity of animals who had lived long enough to stop caring what anyone thought of them. One hen, the largest, had a patch of bare skin across her back, where feathers had never grown back after a hard winter 2 years prior. She was, by any farmer's honest assessment, done. Gallagher watched the two of them load the birds into a slatted crate he threw in as part of the deal. His expression was not unkind, but it carried something close to pity. "You folks got a plan for these?" he asked. "We do," she said. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he doesn't believe something but respects the person saying it. "Well, they'll eat anything. I'll tell you that much. Corn, scraps, bugs, grass. They're tough birds," he paused. "Tough in more ways than one, I expect." She thanked him. Her husband shook his hand. They drove home in the late afternoon light, the crate secured behind them, 43 birds shifting their weight with every rock in the road. Back on their claim, they set the chickens loose in the pole barn and fenced the south run with split rails and wire scavenged from a collapsed section of their east fence. The birds spent their first evening exploring the space with what could only be described as cautious approval. The large, bare-backed hen claimed a corner immediately and did not move from it. That night, sitting at the table after the lamp was lit, they began to plan in earnest. Not with paper, they had little enough of that, but in the way people who work with their hands think best, tracing ideas out loud, interrupting each other, circling back. She had cooked fried chicken before, of course. Everyone on the frontier had. You killed an old bird. You fried it fast in hot lard. You ate it because it was there. That was not what she had in mind. What she had in mind was different. It had been forming quietly for months, built from memory and instinct, and one particular afternoon 2 winters ago, when she had been snowed in at her aunt's house in Missouri and had watched the woman fry a chicken in a way she had never seen before or since. The crust. The way it had shattered when you bit into it. The way the meat had stayed, somehow, both tender and deeply flavored at once. She had never forgotten that crust. And now, for the first time, she had reason to try to recreate it. She talked about that Missouri afternoon the way a person talks about a dream they are afraid to lose. Carefully, with pauses, as though the wrong word might blur the edges of it. He listened without interrupting. That was one of the things she had come to rely on in him, the quality of his listening. He did not listen the way some men did, waiting for the silence that meant it was his turn. He listened as though what she was saying mattered to the work ahead of them both. The crust, she said, had come from something more than flour. She was certain of it. Her aunt had moved through that kitchen without explaining herself, the way experienced cooks do, and she had been young enough then that she had not thought to ask. But she remembered a bowl of something pale and thick sitting beside the flour. Buttermilk, she thought, and something dry mixed into the flour itself. Not just salt, but something else. Something that had given the finished crust a color deeper than ordinary frying, and a smell that had filled the whole house and pulled her aunt's husband in from the barn without being called. He turned that over in his mind. Buttermilk they could get. The Hannigan place 2 miles east kept a dairy cow that produced more than they could use. The dry seasoning was the question. He asked her what she thought it might have been, and she said she did not know for certain, but she had ideas. She had been watching what grew along the creek and up the south-facing slope, where the soil was dry and sandy. There were things out there that she had been thinking about for longer than she had admitted to him. He smiled at that. He had suspected as much. She had a habit of carrying plans quietly until they were ready. They agreed on this much that night. The old birds would need time before they were worth frying. Tough muscle needed to soften. That meant feeding them carefully, keeping them calm, letting them move, but not exhaust themselves. He said he would build a proper pen in the morning, something with real shade and a windbreak on the north side. She said she wanted to mix the feed herself. Cracked corn, yes, but also something she had been thinking about. A mash with buttermilk stirred in, which she believed would do something to the flavor of the meat from the inside out. He looked at her across the table, the lamp throwing long shadows up the log walls, and said that they were either going to make something remarkable or they were going to have the most expensive pot of stew in the territory. She laughed, genuinely, and the sound of it did something good to the small room. They did not have much. $4 spent, a pen not yet built, a flock of worn-out birds dozing in borrowed space behind the barn, and a recipe that existed so far only in the imperfect. Memory of a snowed-in afternoon years ago, and the stubborn conviction of a woman who did not give up easily on an idea once it had taken hold. But they had a plan, and on the frontier, a solid plan between two people who trusted each other was not nothing. It was, in fact, almost everything. They built the pen in 3 days. He split the fence rails himself, working from first light until the shadows grew long enough to trip a man, while she hauled water from the creek in a bucket yoke she had fashioned from a bent ash branch and 2 lengths of rope. The ground was hard with late autumn cold, and driving the post took more effort than either of them admitted out loud. But by the 3rd evening, the pen stood solid, with a low shelter on the north side packed with prairie grass and dry leaves for insulation. She had lined the nesting areas with clean straw, shaken loose and layered deep, and she had hung an old horse blanket along the north wall to cut the worst of the wind. The birds were moved from behind the barn without ceremony. They walked slowly, these old hens and tired roosters, blinking in the pale morning light as though mildly surprised to find anyone still interested in their welfare. She watched them settle into the new pen and felt something she could not quite name. Not pity exactly, but a kind of quiet kinship. Things that were not young anymore, not impressive to look at, still capable of something if handled with patience. The buttermilk mash was her creation entirely. She sourced the buttermilk from a neighbor 2 miles east who kept dairy cows and was happy enough to part with the excess for a fair price. She mixed it warm with cracked corn and a measure of ground grain, and then she added what she had gathered the previous autumn from the prairie margins: dried wild thyme, a little sage, the faint dusty sweetness of dried chamomile. He watched her measure and stir the first batch and asked no questions, which was a form of respect she recognized and appreciated. The birds took to the mash immediately. There was something almost undignified about how eagerly they crowded the trough. These old creatures who had presumably seen every variety of farmyard disappointment. She took it as a good sign. He began keeping a small log by the barn door, marking each bird's condition every few days. Not with sentiment, but with the careful eye of a man who had learned that observation was cheaper than any other tool. He noted which birds were gaining weight, which seemed sluggish, which had begun to carry themselves differently, with a kind of settled contentment in their movements. She reviewed his notes each evening by the lamp, asking questions, suggesting adjustments. The recipe itself was still evolving. She had the memory of that snowed-in afternoon, the smell of lard heating in a deep iron pot, the way the crust had shattered when pressed, the particular silence in the room when the first piece had been tasted. But memory was a rough draft. Getting back to that moment, or past it to something better, would require the actual doing. She had begun writing down what she remembered in the back pages of the household ledger, in her precise, small handwriting, with blank lines left where she was not yet certain. They were not ready to cook yet. The birds needed more time, and so did the recipe. But the work was moving forward, and the cold November air smelled faintly of possibility. December arrived on the Wyoming plain like a deliberate warning. The temperature dropped hard in the first week, the kind of cold that crept beneath door frames and settled into the floorboards, and she found herself rising before dawn, not merely from habit but from necessity, to stoke the fire before the cabin dropped to something genuinely dangerous. The chickens, housed in the small lean-to barn where 2 milk cows also wintered, were faring better than anyone in town would have predicted. He had banked the barn walls with packed straw and stretched oilcloth across the single window gap, and the body heat of the animals together made the space warmer than the cabin's own corner where the woodpile lived. She began cooking in earnest that second week of December, not the full preparation, but what she thought of as the learning work. Small batches. She would take one bird at a time, one of the earliest hens to reach what she considered finished condition, and work through the process from beginning to end, making notes immediately after while the details were still sharp. She used the back ledger pages and, when those filled, cut brown paper from flour sacks into careful squares and stitched them together along one edge with a needle and cotton thread. Her own recipe book, she called it to herself, though she did not say so aloud. He watched her experiments with steady interest. He never offered opinions she had not asked for, but he was present in a way that mattered, refilling the water bucket without being asked, keeping the fire at the particular even heat she needed, tasting when she held something out to him, and answering honestly when she asked what was missing. His palate was not sophisticated, but it was consistent, and consistency was exactly what she needed. What she was chasing was difficult to name, but easy to recognize when it was absent. The crust had to have a shattering quality, brittle at the surface, with a yielding inner layer that held the bird's own juice against the meat. The seasoning had to announce itself without overwhelming. She was working with black pepper, dried prairie sage she had gathered herself in September, a measured hand with salt, and a small amount of something she had not committed to the ledger yet, a spice she had been turning over in her mind since that first accidental success in early November. She was not ready to write it down. Writing it down felt like a kind of certainty she had not yet earned. The lard temperature was its own puzzle. Too cool and the crust absorbed grease and turned heavy. Too hot and the outside darkened before the inside had finished, leaving something that looked promising and delivered disappointment. She was working on reading the lard the way a river woman reads current, by sight and sound and a few small tests before committing the whole bird. The neighbors, for their part, had largely stopped paying attention to the homestead at the edge of the creek road. The joke had grown old. A person could only mock a quiet couple for so long before it became more effort than entertainment. She preferred it that way, The silence gave her room to work. The silence gave her room to work, and she used every hour of it. December came in hard across the creek road, carrying a wind that found every gap in the cabin chinking and made the fire work twice as hard to hold its own. He spent 3 days resealing the walls with a mixture of clay and dry grass he had been saving since autumn, pressing it in with his bare hands until his fingers cracked from the cold. She kept the iron stove burning steady and used the enforced closeness of the season to refine what she was learning. Winter had a way of compressing time and sharpening attention, and she had come to be grateful for it. There were 11 chickens left in the yard now, not counting the 4 they had already eaten through in testing. The survivors moved through the frost-stiffened grass in the slow, unhurried manner of birds that had been fed well and had no reason to rush anything. She watched them sometimes from the window while the lard heated. They looked different from the ragged, hollow-chested birds they had brought home in October. Their feathers had a weight to them. Their movement had settled into something almost dignified. She had thought, more than once, that the old farmers who sold them had made a poor trade. He came inside one afternoon, stamping cold from his boots, and stood at the table watching her work a piece of the thigh meat in the cast iron. She had adjusted the heat 3 times already, raising and lowering the iron grate over the coals with a folded cloth, and he could see in the set of her jaw that she was close to something. She lifted the piece and turned it in the light from the window. The crust held its shape. It did not sag. The color was a deep, even amber all the way around, without the pale patches that had troubled the earlier attempts. She set it on the cloth and waited the full count of minutes she had determined through trial, letting the heat distribute itself through the meat without being hurried. He sat down across from her without speaking. She cut the piece carefully and looked at the inside. Done clean to the bone, no trace of pink, and the juice that ran from it was clear as creek water in July. She slid 1/2 across to him. He ate it slowly, which was itself a kind of answer, because he was not a man who ate anything slowly unless there was a reason to. When he finished, he folded his hands on the table and looked at her with an expression she had seen before. Not often, but enough times to know what it meant. It was the look he wore when a problem had resolved itself completely, when all the pieces had finally come to rest in the right positions and there was nothing left to argue with. He said it was ready. She said she thought so too, but she wanted to make it 4 more times before she believed it. He nodded because that was the kind of woman she was, and he had never once in their years together wished she were any different. Outside, the creek had begun to ice at the edges. She made it 4 more times over the next 2 weeks, each time noting what changed and what held steady. The second batch she pulled 30 seconds earlier than the first, and the crust was lighter but lost something in the depth of it. The third she returned to the original time and added a 1/2 pinch more of the dried thyme she'd gathered from the creek bank in autumn. The fourth she kept identical to the third and watched to see if it repeated. It did. The fifth she made with a bird slightly older and heavier than the others, to see if the recipe could hold a cross variation, and it held. He had not been idle during those 2 weeks. While she worked the cast iron and the big black kettle, he worked the land claim paperwork and the lumber. He had spoken with a man in town who owed him a quiet favor from the previous spring, and that man had access to rough-cut pine at a price that was still painful but survivable. He measured the east side of their property 3 times and drew the shape of what he intended to build on a flat piece of scrapboard with a carpenter's pencil. A lean-to structure with a proper plank counter, a stone base for the cooking fire, and a simple overhang to keep weather off. Not grand, but real. They talked about it each evening at the table after supper. She asked how many people they could serve at once. He said maybe 6 at a stretch, 8 if they stood. She said they would need a second kettle, which he already knew, and they agreed the second kettle would come from the first week's earnings, not before. She asked what they would charge. He said a price, and she said it was too low. He thought about it and said she was probably right. They settled on a number that felt both honest and serious. The kind of number that told a traveler the food was worth the ride without suggesting anyone was getting rich. The ice along the creek deepened through December, and the temperature dropped far enough that their breath came in clouds even inside the cabin by early morning. She began keeping the old birds in the barn at night, which was warmer by the body heat of the 2 pigs and the mule, and she noticed the birds settled faster and came through the cold without losing condition. She started counting how many she could reasonably fatten and cycle through in a single week, working the numbers on a piece of brown paper by the lamp. He watched her do the figuring and did not interrupt. After a while, she said they would need more birds than what they had. He said he had been thinking the same thing. They looked at each other across the low lamplight and both understood what that meant. It meant going back to the same farmers who had laughed, hat in hand, to ask for what they had once been mocked for wanting. She said she didn't mind being laughed at so long as they were the ones laughing last. He said that had always been the plan. She folded the paper and tucked it beneath the lamp base. The wind came up hard off the prairie that night, rattling the door in its frame. The next morning, he hitched the mule before the sun had fully cleared the ridge and drove back out along the frozen ruts toward the nearest farms. She stayed behind to tend the birds and keep the fire going beneath the cast iron, testing a batch they had held back from the previous day's service. She wanted to refine the heat of the oil, which had been running slightly too cool at the bottom of the kettle, leaving the crust less crisp than she wanted on the underside. She adjusted the fire with split cedar, which burned hotter than cottonwood, and watched the oil closely until the surface shimmered with a faint haze. The difference was small, but she felt it immediately when she lowered the first piece in and heard the sound change, sharper, more decisive, a sound that meant the crust was forming in the first few seconds the way it was supposed to. He came back before midday with the wagon half full. There were 11 birds from one farm and 7 from another, all of them the kind of aging stock that ate more than they laid and cost a man his patience. He had paid a fair price, not a desperate one, and the farmers had taken the coins without much ceremony. One of them had said something under his breath that he did not repeat to her, but she could read it in the set of his jaw when he came through the door, and she did not ask. She helped him unload the birds into the barn pen and gave them cracked corn mixed with dried clover she had stored through the autumn. That afternoon, 2 wagons came up the road without warning, one carrying a family of 4, and one carrying a pair of freighters who had heard about the place from a man at the general store in Caldwell. She had not expected anyone so early in the day and had only a partial batch ready. She told the freighters it would be a short wait, and they said they had nowhere urgent to be, which she had learned was the best kind of customer. While the oil came up to heat, she sliced more bread and set out the crocks of butter and the jar of pepper vinegar she had started keeping on the table as a condiment after a traveler from Tennessee had asked whether she had anything sharp to cut the richness of the meat. He came in from the barn and saw the wagons and took off his coat and went to work beside her without a word needing to pass between them. He knew where everything was kept, knew the timing she used, knew when to turn a piece and when to leave it alone. They moved around each other in the small space the way people do when they have been working together, long enough that the work itself has become a kind of language. By the time the freighters sat down, the crust was exactly the color she had been reaching toward all autumn. She watched one of them take the first bite and go very still, the way a man does when something is better than he expected. The freighter set the piece down, looked at his partner across the table, and then looked back at the piece as though he needed to confirm what had just happened to him. His partner had already taken a bite of his own and was holding it away from his face at arm's length, the way a man does when he wants to get a good look at something remarkable. She kept her expression steady and went on working at the cast iron, but she felt the warmth of it move through her chest all the same. After this many months, she still felt it. She did not think she would ever stop feeling it. He came to stand beside her under the pretense of checking the oil, and she heard him draw a quiet breath and let it out slowly. That was all. Between them, it was enough. The freighters ate 2 full pieces each before the first one leaned back and asked what she had done to it. She told him the soak and the buttermilk and the way the hens were kept, and he shook his head as though the explanation could not possibly account for what was in his mouth. His partner asked whether they could buy a piece wrapped in cloth to carry with them, said he had a brother 2 days north who would not believe him if he came empty-handed. She said she could do that. By the time the morning had worn into midday, she had served 4 separate parties, and the pot had been replenished 3 times. He had gone to the cold cellar twice for more dressed birds. She had started a second skillet because the first could not keep the pace. The bench outside the door was occupied at all times by someone either waiting to eat or reluctant to leave, sitting in the thin November sunlight with their boot heels hooked over the front rung and their hands folded like men who had found an unexpected reason to be still. He came inside, and she noticed him pause at the window and look out at the bench. She came to look too. 3 men sat in a loose row, none of them talking, all of them watching the road in a manner that suggested they were in no danger of going anywhere. One had his hat pushed back. One had his eyes closed. He said, low and quiet, that they were going to need more birds before the week was out. She said she had already been thinking on it. There were 3 farms she had not written to yet. She thought the Halverson place had a flock that had been giving trouble. He nodded and said he would ride out in the morning. She turned back to the skillet, and he set a fresh measure of lard at the edge of the heat so it would be ready when she needed it. And they worked on through the afternoon the way they always did, close enough to speak without raising their voices, close enough that she knew without looking when he moved and where he went. Outside, someone on the bench said something to someone else, and both of them laughed. That laughter drifted in through the open door and settled over the room like something comfortable, like smoke from a good fire. She heard it and kept her eyes on the skillet, but her mouth moved at the corner in a way that was not quite a smile and not quite not one either. By the time the last of the afternoon travelers had eaten and the bench outside sat empty, The light had gone the color of cooling embers, and the air carried the first edge of autumn in it. She wiped down the long board they used as a counter while he carried the empty crocks out to the well to rinse. The grease pot was strained and covered. The cast iron was scraped clean and set to dry near the last warmth of the stove. It was the same order of things they had settled into without ever discussing it, each one knowing what the other would reach for next. He came back in and leaned against the door frame and looked at what they had built. It was not much to look at. The walls were still rough-hewn. The roof had a place near the north corner that would need tending before hard frost. The table where people sat was a door laid across two barrels and covered with oilcloth. But every seat had been filled twice over that day, and the tin box behind the flour sack held more coin than they had carried between them in the first 3 years on this land. She stood beside him and looked at it too. She said that she still thought about the morning they had unloaded those first birds. How they had smelled. How thin and rough they were. How a man from the neighboring claim had leaned on his fence and told them they were throwing good money into a dry hole. He said he remembered. She said that the strange thing was, she had not been afraid that morning. She had been tired and uncertain, but not afraid. She had looked at those old hens stepping stiffly down off the wagon and thought that something could still be made of them. That worn out did not mean finished. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought she had been talking about the chickens. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything else about it. Outside, the road that ran past the shack was still. A hawk crossed the last of the daylight high overhead and was gone. Somewhere down the valley, a dog barked twice and then stopped. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like something being smoothed flat. She took his hand without ceremony, the way she had taken it 1,000 times, and he held it the way he always did, as though he intended to keep it. Tomorrow there would be more birds to fetch and more lard to render, and more hands reaching across the oilcloth with coin. But that was tomorrow. For now the skillet was clean and the road was quiet. And they had made something out of almost nothing, the way they always had, the two of them, together.